the topic is about climate policy. You might have noticed, by the way, that President Obama had actually signed an agreement with the premier in China for both countries to reduce emissions. But my field is not about those international negotiations. The question for me is, if we're going to reduce emissions according to that international agreement, or indeed a more worldwide negotiated agreement among many countries of the world that was partly negotiated in Lima, Peru, and where there's supposed to be some signatures next year in Paris. In any case, whatever the U.S. agrees to for cutting greenhouse gas emissions, could be good for the environment, good for avoiding the worst aspects of climate change. The question for today is how to do that. What kinds of policies are available and which ones work better than others? In other words, I'm going to focus on domestic policy. So let's see. Just in case you've been asleep for several years and didn't notice, there's a lot of scientific studies out there about greenhouse gas emissions. And so the predictions from the scientists are that global mean surface temperature is going to increase by 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, which is like 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, which will cause all kinds of problems. And by the way, it's not just temperature. There will be sea level rise, increased number of storms, increased number of floods, and increased number of droughts, both. You get more floods each year and more droughts each year.
That makes sense. You mean that sort of thing?
The negotiators are trying to achieve an agreement that will limit those, the temperature increases to 2 degrees centigrade, but that's basically not going to happen. We're already on track for 3 or 4 degrees centigrade, and we want to try to minimize that increase by doing anything we can that's not too costly now. And so there's bound to be a trade-off between costs and benefits when we decide how much to try to reduce worldwide emissions. But whatever amount we're going to cut emissions is more cheaply done sooner and gradually than to wait until it's an emergency and to try to cut emissions drastically. That would be expensive. But just to see where we're headed here in Illinois, it looks like even under the moderate lower emission scenario, the temperatures in Illinois by the middle of the century could be the same as what you now see in Tennessee or Mississippi, and then eventually over Louisiana. That's with emission reductions. Without emission reductions, we have the red view there with the Illinois returning to the temperatures that I'm familiar with in Austin, Texas, where I lived from 1994 to 2008, according to Amy's introduction. And let me tell you, it's hot there in the summer, many days over 100 degrees on a sort of regular basis. So if we want to try to help the world avoid all of that and other flooding around the world, and by the way, sea level rise in poor countries like Bangladesh could lead to hundreds of millions of refugees displaced by loss of their lands in a low-lying country like Bangladesh. So what is each country to do? Each country faces the same kind of domestic policy problem. The politicians tend to be fond of traditional regulations or mandates. That is to say, regulations about energy efficiency, about how to make dishwashers and washing machines and furnaces that use less energy, and for the same functionality, or mandates that auto manufacturers must achieve certain amount of fuel efficiency. That always struck me as a little odd for a democracy, because it's a little bit like a Soviet-style planned economy for the government to be telling everybody exactly what to do. But there are alternatives. The second choice here are things like direct subsidies for certain technologies, and that would include tax credits for insulating your home and things that would improve energy efficiency. And I'm going to try to talk during this session about the advantages of economic incentives, which is why it might be wise and more cost-effective and cheaper to achieve the same total amount of emission reduction by using economic incentives such as a cap and trade or carbon tax. I know a lot of people are not going to like that, but bear with me for the hour, and I'll tell you how some of what you don't like could be minimized or offset. So to understand why those might work best, here's my most academic slide. A carbon price would minimize the cost per ton of greenhouse gas emission abatement in two ways. It has two key features. One is what I call the substitution effect, namely, it changes the relative price of inputs. It makes carbon-intensive fuels more expensive, and it induces the firm to change their mix of inputs, away from carbon-intensive fossil fuels and do something else instead. So electricity generation, for example, they could switch from coal to natural gas or to solar or wind and reduce the carbon emissions per kilowatt hour. There's also a output effect, which is that because of the remaining use of coal and natural gas, it's going to raise the price of electricity or any output that is carbon intensive, and provide incentive to consumers to buy less output. That is just to turn off the lights when you leave the rooms. And sometimes that's cheap and easy, or you could change your driving patterns. On a nice day, you could ride a bicycle. In other words, less demand for gasoline and other fossil fuels, if that's cheap and easy. But the point is to achieve those forms of abatement sort of requires this output effect, that gasoline is more expensive, and that's supposed to encourage people to use less gasoline, or that electricity is more expensive, and that would encourage people to use less electricity and to buy the fuel efficient or energy efficient appliances. But of course, politicians don't like that output effect. They don't want electricity prices to be higher, and the reason is basically because of this next slide, or one of the reasons anyway. Of course, the politicians are trying to protect the voters, but the distributional pattern of an increased price of electricity is regarded to be regressive, which means that the high-income people spend a lower fraction of their income on electricity. So across the horizontal axis, we have the low-income people to the left and the high-income people to the right. And the height of the bar is the percentage of total consumption that's spent on electricity. So low-income people are spending 4 or 5 or 6% of their income on electricity because it's a necessity. High-income people have a lot more income. They probably spend more on electricity, by the way, because they have bigger houses, but their income is high enough that spending on electricity is a lower fraction of their income. And so the distributional pattern here, your general downward sloping line, indicates a regressive pattern. You increase electricity prices by 10%, that's going to take a higher fraction of income from low-income people than it takes as a fraction of income from high-income people. The other distributional pattern in this picture is between regions. And so you can see the Midwest, where Illinois is located, generally uses less electricity than the South, where it's hot and they need more air conditioning. So there would be redistributions. In other words, Illinois could benefit to some extent or bear less cost than the South, where they need the electricity for air conditioning. So the politicians would don't want to do that. They'd rather have energy efficiency requirements or residential building standards or subsidies like tax credits or cash for clunkers or low carbon fuel standards and all these things. This is jargon that you've really heard before, and subsidies like guaranteed government loans. But the problem is that that's like picking a winner. Now, can you tell which of those is going to be the most cost effective? How many of you have engineering degrees? How many of the politicians have advanced engineering degrees so that they actually know which of those is cheapest? So what do you think? And this is where I usually get audience participation, but some people think solar power is the way to go. Some people think wind power is the way to go. Those are low carbon, and nuclear power is similarly low carbon, and we can reduce gasoline carbon emissions by changing to electric vehicles. So if I ask an audience, if you were all able to respond, normally in an audience like this, we'd have some people choosing each of those things. But my point here really is you don't know, and I don't know either, and the politicians certainly don't know which of those is the cheapest way to achieve a given amount of greenhouse gas emission reduction. And by the way, it's going to depend on location. So I would not use solar power in Seattle where it's cloudy all day, you know, and you know, you wouldn't necessarily use wind power where there's no wind, or you know, it's going to differ by location. And so there's national policy that you know, mandates or requires certain technologies is not going to work very well. And so in a way, it's better to let the firms and consumers decide for themselves, and that's, of course, what an incentive does. Rather than having the regulators or the politicians to pick winners. And, you know, it's a guessing game. The incentives would let the households and firms decide. So here's my representation of that, a demonstration, so to speak. Suppose there's a covered sector like electricity where you're going to talk about emission abatement, and we're talking about the cost per ton, the height here, for each project. And each one of these bars is going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1 million tons. It's just a matter of how much it costs per ton. Well, there's lots of different options, and each of those has the same benefits but different costs. And so which should we do? Well, not necessarily all of them. You know, you certainly don't want to do D if that's the highest cost. But we don't know what those costs are. These are known only to the firms or to the people themselves. You know, only the driver can decide how cheap it is to change their driving patterns, cheap and easy, or whether that's difficult or that they need to drive. You know, the consumers will decide when they need electricity. We don't want to be telling people when they need electricity or not. Or we don't even really want to be telling electricity generators that they should use this technology instead of that technology, because the people that work for those electricity generators are the ones who really know what are the best technologies. And so, you know, the politicians might decide, oh, you know, my constituents tell me that B and F are the best, but, you know, it's just, if they're guessing, it's not likely to be the cheapest. In contrast, if there were a price per ton, like this dotted line that's $16 per ton, if that's just the price of a permit or the tax per ton of carbon emissions. And I'll come back, by the way, with the question of what to do with the revenue. But with that kind of a price, the firms can decide for themselves. They're not going to do projects D and F. They'll just pay the tax instead, or the price, because it's cheaper. But the people that could do A, B, C, or E would do those projects because that's cheaper to cut those emissions than to pay for those emissions. And hence you get the cheapest forms of abatement. Now, moreover, there's this other sector outside of electricity, the industrial sector, the residential sector, the, you know, whatever it might be. And they're not doing anything if they're not facing any price. So they're whited out here because they have no incentives to do anything. The most cost-effective plan is one that would provide the same price to all possible emissions all the way across the board there, and then we would have these other cheap things also done to reduce emissions. So that's the idea for how that works. Now, the advantage is, just to summarize what I just said, the policymakers don't need that cost information. The firms and the technicians at those firms can decide what's best for them. You know, the firms can choose the low-cost methods. And by the way, they don't even really need to measure the emissions coming out the smokestack, because those are strictly related to the carbon content of the fuel. So if you know how many carbon atoms are in a ton of coal, then you know how to collect those permit prices at the mine or at the oil well or gas pipeline. And it raises the price of that carbon-intensive fuel for everybody. So, in contrast, the regulations and subsidies, you know, they might reduce the carbon per unit of electricity, but those politicians are generally trying not to raise the cost of electricity, so they miss some forms of cheap abatement, like turning off the lights, and only that carbon price can get that output effect. Now, to the revenue, the carbon price, if the government has a tax on carbon or if they sell the permits and collect the revenue, then that revenue can be used to help low-income families and to offset that sort of bad adverse distributional pattern that we looked at earlier. And so I'm on to revenue now. By the way, as Amy indicated, I have a sort of mixed background of experience and study of the tax system, economic effects of taxation, but also of environmental policy. So I took a look at this 2014 State Budget Crisis Task Force. It was co-chaired by the former Lieutenant Governor of New York and Paul Volcker, the chair of the Federal Reserve, and they write this long report. Took several years to produce this, talking about problems for state budgets. There's Medicaid spending growth, underfunded retirement. We know about that in Illinois for sure. Narrow eroding tax base, volatile tax revenues, and 50 different states have different budget practices, and sometimes they're trying to hide what they're doing and to mask those imbalances and make it look better than it is. This particular budget crisis task force studied 6 states, mostly large ones. They're not all the 6 largest, but it does include Illinois, so that's kind of interesting. And they have a case study of all those, and they point out problems with each of those. But it's sort of backwards looking. They're talking about past budget practices. They're not doing projections. And besides, each state budget, they're not really comparable because each state budget is different. It may include or exclude each special trust fund. The highway trust fund may be in the main budget or a separate budget. The main budget may or may not include a state pension fund or something else. And besides, they're required to balance the budget, so they sometimes, fidget the numbers to make it look like it's balanced, or at least to meet the legal requirements, which sort of masks some states that are in difficult financial positions. All right, so what I did with my colleagues at Illinois was to study each of those 6 states and look at their own projected budget surplus or deficit. So these are not comparable to each other, but there's no real very good way to make them comparable to each other. And then we calculate the percentage of that projected future state budget deficit that could be covered by the sale of permits. Now notice, before you see this next slide, that as you all know, if you're all in Illinois, that the Illinois income tax rate was temporarily raised from 3% to 5%, and this year it's scheduled to fall down to 3%, and so there's some debate what to do. That's under current law. Of course, not everybody wants it to fall all the way to 3%, and not everybody wants it to rise back up to 5%, but we have yet to face that debate, but it's currently scheduled to fall to 3%. And so what happens to the budget deficit? Well, you can see with Illinois here, over the next 4 years, or some past data there, some current data, and some future projections, Illinois changes from surplus to smaller surplus to deficit to bigger deficit. And it just keeps going from there, by the way. It's kind of pointless to show the budget deficit out to the year 2025. But if you did, the budget deficit would be something on the order of $20 billion per year. It's really ridiculous. So something has to be done, and probably not just one thing, a combination of things. We could cut spending, presumably, and might have to raise taxes as well, and maybe cut benefits for retirees. But I don't know what's going to happen. Probably not a single thing, but it is a problem. In other states, California is showing a surplus, and for some reason they're in pretty good situation right now. But I don't quite believe a $5 billion surplus. That's not going to last in Texas or California. Hence the question marks. Their politicians are going to spend that money before they ever realize those surpluses, or they're going to cut taxes or something. So what I did on this calculation was to look at the U.S. Clean Power Plan that I'm going to talk more about in just a minute, what would be the carbon emissions allowed for Illinois electricity sector under that plan, and I'll show you that plan, and figure what a reasonable price for a permit would be, or a tax per ton of carbon to satisfy that federal mandate. And it turns out that would raise eventually, not necessarily by 2015/16, but I really mean this to be a sort of a long-run calculation. So there'd be a phase-in, so it would not really happen by next year, but eventually could be raising something on the order of $1.5 billion a year from a carbon tax or from the sale of cap-and-trade permits, which would cover about, according to this particular calculation, 36%. That's too precise. I just say about a third. But if you could have a carbon tax that covered a third of the Illinois state deficit, that's nothing to sneeze at and is worth considering, especially since we have to do something. By the way, the cap and trade revenue seems most advantageous for Illinois, but that's because Illinois' relatively carbon-intensive use of coal, but so is Virginia. The reason that percentage is so low for Virginia, 6% of their deficit, is because their deficit is absolutely huge on a per capita basis. Look up above. Virginia, the deficit approaches $5 billion a year, even though it's a smaller state than Illinois. So they're in a bad situation, and in a sense, they need the carbon tax revenue more than anybody, even if it does cover only 6% of their huge deficit. But on to the next slide. Oh yeah, under normal circumstances, it's hard to enact a cap and trade. The industry screams bloody murder, and you can't do that to us. And so in the past, under the Clean Air Act, the sulfur dioxide emission permits, a lot of them were handed out to the firms. And by the way, that's like handing valuable pieces of paper to industry, which I'm sure they like and appreciate. I'm not sure it's necessary. It might have been necessary in those years to achieve anything at all because they could block the legislation effectively. The politicians do listen to firms. But things are different under the Clean Air Act use to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you might remember a Supreme Court decision recently, about a year or more ago, in which the Supreme Court ruled that yes, global warming is a health problem. People are dying of heat stroke or will be dying of heat stroke and other heat-related diseases, and let alone floods or droughts or whatever. So this allows the executive branch, the authority, under the Clean Air Act, with no new legislation, the executive branch can regulate greenhouse gas emissions just like other criteria pollutants like sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, the volatile organic compounds, and all NOx and SOx, and all the things that are precursors to ozone that cause health problems. Those are things the EPA now regulates, and the Supreme Court said, okay, the EPA can regulate greenhouse gas emissions the same way. So they came up with a plan that was issued in June of this year, June of 2014, half a year ago. And this plan is now under discussion, and they say that they will issue the final regulation next June. So I'm going to talk about the plan that's under discussion. This still could be modified, but we have to believe the executive branch is going to do something at the federal level to cut greenhouse gas emissions, especially from electric power plants. So under this plan, the way it was articulated 6 months ago, which is now being discussed, the power sector would have to cut emissions by 25 to 30% below 2005 levels within 20 years, or what's, I guess, 10 years remaining. And that's a reduction of 18 to 25%. Now, the way they're going to do that, that's the next slide. So meanwhile, the EPA estimates that the benefits are, in the long run, by 2030, are going to be $60 to $90 billion per year, and that the costs are $6 to $9 billion per year. So in other words, if a simple cost-benefit analysis, that's worthwhile just to the U.S. Never mind the benefits to the rest of the world from reducing global warming. But just to the U.S., the benefits exceed the cost by that much. And the benefits are mostly health-related benefits. And the costs are just, switching from coal to natural gas or wind and solar. So there's net benefits, according to the EPA, by 2030. And, it might mean a 25% reduction of coal use, which is the most carbon-intensive fuel. And it might just mean allowing some of those existing power plants to, coal-fired power plants to retire at the end of their useful life and not building new ones. So we're not going to shut them down, the existing ones, but might not build any new ones and let them retire whenever they're supposed to retire. Natural gas is less carbon intensive, so that might increase a bit for a while just to replace the coal. Solar, by the way, is getting cheaper and cheaper every day, it seems. It's not quite as cheap as natural gas or coal now, but that may be the technology of the future, solar and wind, and I don't know about nuclear, but again, I'm not an engineer. So this EPA plan is really only the electricity sector. As you can see, that's only a third of total greenhouse gas emissions. So this is not going to be totally cost effective by itself because of the diagrams I showed you there earlier with the bars. We could have cost-effective emission reduction within electricity, but that would not do anything to reduce emissions elsewhere in the industry or agriculture or transportation. And so by excluding those sectors, it's not going to minimize the overall cost. The ideal plan to an economist would be to have the same low price, $10 a ton, everywhere, instead of having $20 a ton just in electricity and zero elsewhere, for reasons I showed you. Anyhow, the way they do this is a different goal for each state, all based on a single formula, which is kind of interesting. In other words, they write down one formula, and here's a general rule about how states might be able to change their emissions. And they use the one formula and plug in different numbers for each state and get a different target for each state. And then each state gets a rate, which is a carbon intensity per kilowatt hour. And I'm going to show you some of those rates for some of those states in a second. And it generally uses the fact that the carbon emissions from coal-fired power plants can be reduced even without shutting down those coal-fired plants, just by using them more efficiently and by switching the dispatch order to the natural gas, as we'll see. And they talk about these four building blocks, which look like this. Here's the four building blocks. Improve efficiency of the existing coal-fired power plants, and they're just different technologies for being able to reduce the carbon per kilowatt hour even while you're running the coal. But then you can change the relative use away from coal towards natural gas, and it's just a matter of how much each one runs. So in other words, they're just saying run the natural gas plant more and run the coal-fired plant less. And meanwhile, we should be adding new cleaner sources. We're not in other words, the whole changeover doesn't have to be too drastic or catastrophic or anything. We're not going to shut down the coal-fired power plants. We just want them to run more efficiently, use coal a little less and the natural gas a little more, and then eventually we'll be adding wind and solar. And by the way, we want to cut demand by turning off the lights when you leave the room. Well, states differ on their use of coal, so they have a different weights on that. The hydro states like Washington and Oregon hardly use any coal. And they differ on their use of natural gas. So when you plug the different states' numbers into this formula, states differ on how much wind and how much solar potential they have. You're going to get a different answer for each state. And the answers overall look like this. You can see how the overall emissions would be reduced by about 2,100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions on the vertical axis, from 2,100 to about 1,500, and those are each of the four building blocks. You can see the largest one is number 2, which is more use of existing natural gas combined cycle units in place of coal, just by changing the dispatch order. So here's what happens to the different states. This is the EPA Clean Power Plan emission rate reduction targets that come out of that one formula. And you can see Illinois here has a relatively high emissions because it has relatively high use of coal, not as high as Kentucky or Montana, but it's, you know, compared to a lot of states, Illinois uses more coal. And then they're going to have to reduce the amount of that blue bar. In other words, their current level is at the end of the blue bar to the right, and their target would be just the orange bar, the interim goal, 2020 to 2029. And that's how much Illinois will have to reduce under this plan. But not down to zero. They're not going to have to shut down their coal plants. You see, Illinois still gets a bigger allowance than Idaho, where they have lots of hydropower, or Maine. I think I have there's Maine. They have hydropower. So they don't get a big coal allowance or a carbon allowance. Their target is very small. They're going to be limited on their carbon emissions. And they actually don't have to reduce that much because they're not using much coal already. Maine gets a lot of their hydropower from Quebec, actually. Anyhow, there's Montana. You know, they have a lot of fossil fuels. So they start with bigger emissions, and they have a higher limit, higher target. So they're going to be able to continue use of their coal. So again, to summarize some of what I've said, because I need to be wrapping up a little bit here, it's going to minimize the cost of emission abatement. It'll raise eventual revenue by a number I said for Illinois of $1.5 billion a year. You know, that's not a huge number. It's small, for example, compared to the state income tax. It's raising about $15 billion, but it's 10% of that number. So you know, it would allow the state, they don't have to raise the income tax rate back up to 5%. You know, according to these numbers, they could raise it just back to about 4.5%, which is better for all income earners in the state of Illinois, if you're willing to put up with this price on carbon instead of having an income tax. You know, and or it could be used to cut a third of the long-run deficit. But the point is there's going to be this federal mandate. So we're going to have to do something. And, you know, it seems to me we might as well do something that helps to reduce what our income tax would have to be otherwise by having a cap and trade with a sale of revenue instead of Soviet-style command and control mandates telling everybody what to do. By the way, here's another advantage of this cap and trade. Illinois can shift some of the burden to other states. The reason is that the coal-fired power plants are basically always on because they're cheap per kilowatt hour. So there's no real reason to turn them off. They can run more efficiently, but they're always on. It's the on and off natural gas units that effectively set the price of electricity, you know, the demand at the margin, as we say. And those are less carbon intensive. So the price of electricity is going to rise a little bit, you know, maybe 10% because of the however much carbon is used by natural gas. But that's not enough of an increase in the price of electricity to cover the high cost of coal because that's more carbon intensive. As a consequence, the owners of those coal-fired power plants might take a loss. They're not going to shut down because they're cheap to operate, and they're not going to throw away their $3 billion investment in a power plant. But the stock price might go down a bit. But of course, those plants most of them are owned nationally, and the stockholders are out of state. So if they take a loss, it's just basically a way that Illinois could export its tax burden to residents outside of Illinois. In case you think, you know, that's a bit of a trick, the other states might be trying to do that also, and there's no reason for Illinois to avoid that. So the overall, here's my overall summary slide. This is really about the main message of the entire talk here. Kind of reminds me of a bad joke. The way the joke runs is like this. Unfortunately, he fell out of an airplane. Fortunately, he had a parachute. Unfortunately, the parachute didn't open. Well, fortunately, there's a haystack below him. Unfortunately, there's a pitchfork in the haystack. Fortunately, he missed the pitchfork. Unfortunately, he missed the haystack. Well, there's always pros and cons to this, but the reason I thought of that joke is because of what's going on with the climate policy. Unfortunately, we have this huge, serious climate problem. It's going to cause damages in the U.S. and even worse damages in the rest of the world. Fortunately, your private actions can do something about it. You can drive your car a little less. You can turn off the lights when you leave the room. We're all conscious of the environment, some people more than others, but we can do something about it. But unfortunately, that's not going to be enough. That can reduce the climate problem if everybody does that. But we're going to need something a little more definitive. So unfortunately, government can enact policies to help encourage people to do the right thing and achieve more action. Unfortunately, the public policies are often poorly designed. The mandates that I talked about could be very expensive, requiring expensive technologies. We do not want to use all solar power. It's expensive. That would be huge costs. So that would be unfortunate. Now, fortunately, academic research can help identify what are those good policies, and that's really what I've been talking about today. So I would like to be the white knight and save us from incurring high costs of reducing carbon emissions, but unfortunately, nobody listens to academics. So that's my talk. The next slide is just the conclusions, including my email address. I think Amy said if you email her, she will send you these slides. So that might be better. But just to bear in mind, each state is going to need to comply in some way with this U.S. plan. The federal government could have raised that revenue by enacting a carbon tax, but they could not get it through the Congress, of course. They basically deferred to the states. They've pushed the target limits on carbon emissions to the states and left it to each state to decide for itself what to do to reach its own target. Well, Illinois could, or any state, could enact a carbon tax or cap and trade to reach that mandated target and do it cost effectively, or to cut their other distorting taxes.
This is a revenue question, and you mentioned that there were penalties associated with non-payment of the tax, I believe. So if are these penalties going to be severe enough to cause compliance, in your opinion? And where would the penalty revenue go?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean, because I'm not sure I mentioned penalties or how, but the idea that I'm talking about is to monitor the amount of carbon being used at each electricity generating plant, and that just means how much coal they purchase. It'd be like a sales tax on their purchase of coal. An extra $20 per ton of carbon. So it depends on what fuel they use. Coal is carbon intensive, so they'd have to pay a bit more just for the purchase of coal, assuming they're going to burn it and cause carbon dioxide emissions of that amount. So that's a tax they'd have to pay. Now, the tax has to be enforceable. I mean, if anybody tries to cheat on their taxes, they have to pay a penalty. I didn't say much about that penalty. That tax is pretty readily enforceable in the United States. We already have all kinds of excise taxes at the state level, like the state gasoline tax, for example. If there were a carbon tax on gasoline, it would look to the consumers just like an increase in the gasoline tax rate and a slightly higher price of gasoline. And that's pretty readily enforceable. There might be a few retailers that try to cheat and avoid paying their taxes, but that's a sort of a standard enforcement problem. And I think for the income tax as well, we have everybody has to fill out their income tax form at the end of the year and pay their income taxes. So the enforcement of the carbon tax would be really no different than any other state tax that's already readily pretty enforceable. If you cheat, you may have to pay a penalty or go to jail, but it would be difficult to cheat. And so I think you'd find these major corporations that generate electricity are not going to cheat because they have a public responsibility and they have to pay their taxes, and they don't want to be shut down by the federal or state government for non-payment of taxes.
Well, we have 2 questions that got typed in. So who implements this in Illinois? What body, committee would initiate this action?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, because I actually think that one of the reasons across the United States at state levels or federal level that we've not yet successfully been able to have any kind of a tax on any kind of emissions is because of the committee structure. Let me talk about the U.S. Congress first. There's an energy committee or an environmental and energy committee that's charged with the responsibility of cleaning up the environment. And they don't have any concerns about revenue. It's just not their mandate, not their portfolio, so to speak. There's a different committee, the House Ways and Means Committee or the Senate Finance Committee, whose job it is to raise revenue, but they have no interest in saving the environment. And so nobody's thinking about this connection the way I've talked about it today. In other words, you could do both things at once if you could get those 2 committees talking to each other or somehow coordinated. And of course, they're all members of Congress, so the Congress could do this, but the committee structure is not helping. There's no reason for the Revenue Committee in the state of Illinois, for that matter, or any other state. There's no reason for the committee that's charged with the responsibility of raising revenue to pay any interest in how Illinois is going to comply with the U.S. Clean Power Plan targets. So they're just raising revenue. They don't want to they don't see a need for a carbon tax or cap and trade. On the other hand, there's some other committee of the state legislature is charged with the responsibility of meeting the U.S. Clean Power Plan. If it passes next June 2015, it's some kind of a mandate, the state of Illinois is going to have to comply. There will be court decisions, by the way. Some states are going to sue to claim that this mandate is not constitutional, and we have yet to see how the Supreme Court's going to rule on that. But I suspect it's going to be held constitutional, according to the previous Supreme Court decision. And, Illinois is going to have to do something. But there's no single committee that's thinking about both of these problems, that is to say, how to raise revenue and how to comply with the federal mandate. So that's an impediment. But if they could get over that, and the 2 houses of the Illinois legislature can all agree on this, it would nonetheless be a wise thing to do. And it would be a state tax. The state has to comply with the federal requirement. And the state needs to raise revenue. I mean, that's who would implement it.
And Andrew Ansel Robinson has a question for you. If regulations and subsidies tend to pick winners, isn't the selection of certain incentives over other incentives simply picking a winner too? Or I guess that's somebody else in that office. Marcus is asking you this question.
Yeah. Certainly in one sense, yes. So, for example, the fact that the U.S. Clean Power Plan is limited to the electricity generating sector. You remember that slide that showed that electricity generation was responsible for only 32% of the greenhouse gas emissions around the country, and transportation is about another third, and there was a industrial sector, other industries that have smokestacks, and then there was agriculture and other categories. If you're going to focus this only on the electricity generating sector, then that's also picking where to achieve your greenhouse gas emissions, and that's not going to be cost effective overall. As I was trying to explain with the chart that had all the bar diagrams appearing and disappearing, if you remember that, the point in the last version of that slide was that if there was the same price per ton of carbon dioxide emissions, say $16 per ton in that figure, in that diagram, across all the sectors, 100% of the economy. In other words, that would involve raising the price of electricity a little bit, and raising the price of gasoline a little bit, and raising the price of home heating fuels a little bit, and all different users of fossil fuels that emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. Then everybody would have the same incentive, and by the way, then the price could be lower. It wouldn't necessarily have to be $16 a ton. The broader the base, the broader the coverage, the lower the rate could be. So you might get it down to $12 a ton or something. Everybody would have the same incentives. Anything you could do to cut your emissions, you could by turning off the lights when you leave the room, or by adding double pane insulated glass to your windows of your house, or by adding insulation to the roof of your house, or by buying a more fuel efficient car. Anything you could do that's cheap and easy, you would do. And that's the point of not picking winners. It allows the individuals to choose for themselves what is the most cheap and easy, instead of having some legislator or politician decide, oh, you need to have this kind of insulation in your home, or you need to buy this kind of car. Or, for example, some politicians think electric cars are great. Well, there's other people that refer to electric cars as, there's some people that refer to electric cars as zero emission vehicles, but they're not. Other people refer to them as coal-powered vehicles because they use electricity generated from coal-fired power plants. So that's not low emission. It depends on the whole mix of power generation and fuels. So, a politician might decide that electricity generation is electric cars is the way to go, but that might really not be the cheapest way to go. And if you just had a carbon tax on everything, people could decide for themselves. And if a state uses a lot of coal-fired power plant, you might not want an electric car because that would be expensive to recharge the car. In a different state with hydropower, then you could avoid the carbon tax altogether by buying an electric car. Each to their own is the point of that, yeah.
We have about 3 more questions and about 5 more minutes. So we'll start with this next one. It's about regressive taxes. Energy taxes can be regressive. If that regressivity were offset by refunding a portion of the cap and trade revenue to lower income citizens, how much would remain for deficit reduction?
Well, that's another good question. In fact, that's one I've actually struggled with a lot in my research. It's actually hard to answer, and it's hard to even identify what the question means. For example, even the wording here says offset by refunding a portion of the cap and trade. Well, it depends on what portion. The more of the revenue that's used to help low-income families, the less is left over for deficit reduction. It also sort of depends, therefore, on how you define what is a low-income family. Like, if you take that to be the poorest 1/3 of the income distribution, then that's a lot of people, and you'd need that much more money to help them meet their higher electricity bills. But if you define it only to be the poorest 10% of people, then it'd be not quite as expensive to help the poorest 10% of people meet their higher electricity bills. It's just fewer people you're trying to help out. So there's a whole spectrum of possibilities, and it matters how you do it. Now, I might point out along the way, what you do not want to do is give them a rebate based on how much they spend on electricity, because that just undoes the output effect that I was talking about earlier. In other words, you need to give all low-income families something that does not depend on how much electricity they use. Because if they get a bigger rebate by using more electricity, that's not going to encourage them to turn off the lights.
Now, you talked a little bit in your presentation about doing some comparative analysis with other states. How do you see this, based on the next question, if this tax is enacted, affecting the competitiveness of the state of Illinois?
Well, as you notice from the, one of the charts I showed, about half of the states in one set of horizontal bars where, Illinois is a relatively high user of coal, and, Maine uses less coal, so they're going to have a less stringent reduction in their greenhouse gas emission target. So that it's in a way it's bad for Illinois because we have a lot of use of coal, and so we're going to have to do something more drastic to reduce our use of coal and switch to natural gas and eventually to solar or wind. You can see those wind mills out there on the central Illinois growing up all over the place all the time. So in some sense, it would raise costs in Illinois to have the carbon tax, but not so much if the carbon tax revenue is used to reduce the deficit or to cut other income taxes, because income taxes are also bad for competitiveness, and having a deficit is bad for competitiveness. So, the state needs a balance. And, they want to have a balance kind of between spending reductions and income tax reductions and property taxes. Well, my point is only that the carbon tax could be part of that mix. You want to balance between those things. And if the carbon tax is helping to raise some revenue that allow us to increase our competitiveness by cutting other taxes, then that might be a good thing.
Well, we're about out of time today for this very in-depth topic, and I want to thank our speaker, Dr. Don Fullerton, for being here. I also want to take a moment to thank the local government team who this webinar series would not be possible without them, and that's Kathy Brown, Corey Buttrey, and Ken Larimore. So with that, if we did not get to your question, please send them to me at aingles@illinois.edu, and we'll make sure we get them answered for you. If you're interested in the PowerPoint, we'll get that to you also. And we want to wish you a great week, and thanks again. Don't forget to come back to some of our other webinars that I have listed there on the screen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.